Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Environment, Sustainability and Society lecture series of the College of Sustainability. My name is Steve Manel and I'm the director of the college. It's our pleasure tonight to host what has been a long time in coming, a little over 2 years now, a lecture that was originally part of last year's McKay lecture series, and it's put on in association with a whole host of partners on an issue that picks up a theme that we began speaking about in quite specific terms about a year ago. I'm not going to tell you a lot about that. I'm just going to say it's a real pleasure as the director of the college and on behalf of the college to welcome those of you who are not part of our college here. We meet every Thursday night at this time to consider the ideas and the inspiration of speakers from various parts of the world, from other parts of Canada and from all around the world, on what it means to have a sustainable future, what are the issues we need to face up to in pursuing a sustainable future. And the issues we're going to speak about tonight around Indigenous communities and their relationship to other communities, especially here in Canada, is a key part of any understanding of a sustainable future. I will do one service announcement on behalf of those of you in the audience who are part of the college or part of the world of environmental students here at Dalhousie. I'll give you a quick reminder. Tomorrow is your Green Gala, your chance to celebrate your accomplishments over the year. It's 7 o'clock at the University Club and it's all free and there's food and everything, and music. So that's one of the many events that are happening this week. The whole other set of events, Brian Noble will be telling us about in a couple of minutes. And I'll introduce Brian now. Brian is really the moving force behind the extravaganza that is this weekend on reconciliation and responsibility for shared futures, all of which is laid out on the poster. And keep reading it while I'm talking and the next two people are talking, because we won't read it to you. Brian's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology here at Dal. He's active in two research areas, one addressing anti-colonial resolution of relations between Indigenous peoples and settler Canada, and the other is the anthropology of science, techniques, and expertise. And in that world, he is the co-manager of the Atlantic node of the Situating Science Knowledge Cluster. In the other mode, he is the moving force behind the series that tonight picks up on a thread from last year and from other times and will continue on in the future. Brian will be coming up to the stage in just a couple of minutes to introduce our speaker tonight. Before Brian does his introduction of the speaker, I would like to welcome Sherry Pictou. Sherry is a Mi'kmaq woman from the Bear River First Nation. She's also currently an ID PhD student here at Dalhousie. And as well, she's the co-chair of the World Forum of Fisher Peoples, and in that work she lobbies for the political and the labor rights of fisherwomen throughout the world. And Sherry's going to perform an important function in welcoming us to the particular place where we are. And afterwards, Brian will introduce our speaker and the rest of the series. So please welcome Sherry Pictou.
Good evening, everybody. And as Steve says, my name is Sherry Pictou, and I'm from a very small Mi'kmaq community known as Elsutuk, which means where the water flows or where the water breaks through, otherwise known as the Bear River First Nation, which is really a polite name for the official name, Bear River Indian Reserve, parcels of land 6A, 6B. So I prefer to think of it as Elsutuk. It is with great honor that I welcome each and every one of you here to Shabakto, the Halifax, Dartmouth area, within the ancestral lands of Mi'kmaq. And Mi'kmaq extends from what is known today, Nova Scotia, to New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, the Gaspé area in Quebec, and northern parts of Maine. Thus, it is with further great honor I welcome you to this series of events aimed at facilitating discussions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people about reconciliation and building socially, politically, and ecologically just futures. It is a historic event when you think about it, because this event has taken place a little over 250 years after the Treaties 1760 and 61 were signed. And those treaties were upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999. These discussions are further historically important for several reasons. One being is that it appears that the modern processes of reconciliation and treaty implementation are subject to neoliberal exploitation of the natural resources, very unsustainable practice, if not outright destructive practices of the market economy, which impacts all of us. Yet, there are many barriers, if not boundaries, that continue to dictate how settlers and Indigenous people are not to interact with one another and remain in our neo-colonial imposed silos. And I personally have been a witness to this in our struggles with the fisheries. Been told do not talk to the non-native fishermen, and the non-native fishermen are told not to talk to the Indigenous people, but to go to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. That's just one example. It is also important that these discussions are taking place in partnership with academia because of the tremendous, and I mean tremendous, influence that academia, research, and knowledge production most often have on the policies that impact our lives. And though we're making progress, and these events are a sign of that progress, in transcending some of these barriers, there is much more work to be done. On March 8, International Women's Day, the late Loretta Saunders, a descendant of Inuit people of Labrador, and a young honor student at St. Mary's University, was being put to rest. I did not know Loretta personally, but I came to know her through the honor of having been asked to help coordinate a couple of talking circles for her students, professors, and friends while she was missing, and then the grim discovery of her tragic death. And it was through this process I learned that in 2014, there are young Indigenous female students who still feel very alienated in higher places of learning. I also learned that I, my daughter, my granddaughter, are at risk of violence, murder, and disappearing altogether 3 to 5 times higher than the rate of other non-Indigenous women in Canada. However, Loretta's story has now inspired a robust campaign by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to bring these facts to the forefront, despite the federal government's refusal of looking into a national inquiry. Thus, I wish to, I just wanted to say Loretta's story on the good side has inspired a robust campaign to keep this into the forefront, these issues, as well as inspired a commitment to provide support to Indigenous students in the university system. And of course, we cannot forget about our friend Chris Metallic, our brother who went missing at Mount Allison University last year and is still missing. Thus, I wish to dedicate these discussions about reconciliation and shared futures in Loretta's memory in hopes of further transcending some of these systematic barriers that we faced in trying to reach true reconciliation and building shared futures. These discussions, as it was said, are in follow-up to the McKay lectures last year, and I'm truly humbled to be in the presence of 3 renowned scholars, Dr. John Burroughs, Dr. Michael Ash, and Dr. James Tully over the next 3 days. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Burroughs and Dr. Ash last year. Dr. Burroughs' wisdom struck my heart with the wisdom of my own grandmother. Dr. Ash's spirit reminds me so much of that ferocious hunter with the gentle demeanor also portrayed by my uncles. Dr. Tully could not make it last year, and so I'm anxious to see the connections he will make in my internal relationship building. And with that, and no further ado, I turn this over to Dr. Brian Noble. Wilalio, thank you. Asid Nogama, all my relations, and welcome.
Thank you, Sherry. That was wonderful. I just wanted to acknowledge Sherry's words and also the Mi'kmaq people on whose lands this university is established. and to also acknowledge her words about the life of Loretta Saunders. And I'm speaking of the life of Loretta Saunders. She's making us all think, I believe, with greater focus and genuine focus on how something very wrong continues in Canada, because we have yet to get to this whole question of reconciling the presence of settler peoples and settler governments in Canada with the fact of living. I'll do this out loud. With the fact, can you hear me back there? I'm a seasoned lecturer. It's going good. With the fact of living on the lands of Indigenous peoples. So this series...
Do your best.
Okay, this series is really about, and the lecture today is one of three, and is about the issue that you see in the slide up above you here. Reconciliation, the responsibility for shared futures. It's the third of three events, as mentioned already. It completes a triad of lectures, one in October 2012 by Dr. Ash, who Sherry mentioned, on understanding the ways of coming together as a peoples through land-sharing treaties, particularly in the 19th century. And we had these, especially in the 19th century and early into the 20th century. And the task now that Dr. Ash has put to us is how to honor those treaties, as well as look to those treaties as an inspiration for how we can live together in the contemporary moment, how we can learn from them. The second lecture was by Dr. John Burrows, again, who was mentioned by Sherry. His lecture, Akino Makewan, Earth Teachings, Stories from the Fall. It looks like we're now talking about stories from the spring tonight with Professor Tully here. And it's quite a spring that we're seeing blowing in today. And in John's talk, he showed us a practice of living relations between Anishinaabe and settler peoples, enlivened by listening to the earth, by listening to our relations as a source for reconciliation. And tonight we come together for the third lecture with our distinguished guest, Professor James Tully. Professor Tully comes from the University of Victoria, and he is among Canada's most highly regarded scholars. He is a Killam Professor, a former Killam Professor, a Trudeau Fellow, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He is the Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Law, Indigenous Governments, and Philosophy at the University of Victoria. And you will have seen books outside of the room here from all three of these scholars that I urge you to have a look at and pick up and purchase and read. He's published, Professor Tully's published prolifically through many books and numerous journal articles. He was a senior researcher with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples as well. And what is most crucial about Professor Tully's contribution, in my estimation, is that he has taught a generation of Indigenous and settler descendant students who are now populating the academy and are bringing forth a model of thinking and an openness to trying to figure out how we move forward together as peoples on Indigenous lands, as Canadian citizens, and as Indigenous peoples. They're represented in two of his books in particular that I would point you to. One has become a very, very fundamental go-to text, Strange Multiplicity, and the other is his three-volume opus, Public Philosophy in a New Key. So rather than go on much further, I would like to bring forward Professor Tully and have you welcome him to give his talk, Reconciliation Here on Earth, Shared Responsibilities.
Well, thank you all for coming out here tonight on a rainy night. It's wonderful to be here. It's taken me 2 years to get here, but I'm very happy to be here tonight. I want to first of all thank Sherry for giving us that introduction, and the Mi'kmaq people and their territory for allowing us to gather here tonight and talk about these issues. I think everything I say tonight is really an attempt on my part to think about what the shared responsibilities are that we have in virtue of the peace and friendship treaties here in Mi'kmaq territory in the 1760s, but also right across Canada. So you can think of everything I have to say as a kind of settler guy trying to make sense of the obligations and responsibilities we have in virtue of being treaty people, as Michael Ash talked about in his first lecture. And I really feel a bit frightened coming after Michael Ash and John Burroughs and Brian Noble's lectures here, because these are three tremendous scholars who have really changed the game in Canada over the last 20 to 30 years. So I'm following in their footsteps here. Can't keep up with them, but I'll try my best tonight to maybe add a little bit to what you've already heard from them over the last 2 years. And I'm not going to talk about this, but because I'm from the West Coast, I have to mention this. So this is by a great Haida artist, a monumental piece of art called the Spirit of Haida. And for me, what Bill Reed is doing in this, some of you may remember it used to be on our $20 bills, and it represented how Indigenous people and Canadians could live together. There was a period there before the Harper government took it off the $20 bill, that it stood for cultural diversity and biological diversity in Canada, and the way we could all row together, even though we're all mixed up and overlapping in all the crazy ways they did in this amazing monumental work of art that's now in front of the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and also a copy of it in the Museum of Civilization, and another copy of it in the Vancouver International Airport. So I love this work of art. So maybe in the question period we could talk about it, but for me it's the kind of interdependency and co-evolution that's going on in the canoe that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'm actually going to read a lecture, because if I talk I don't get through as much, and there are a couple of points I really want to make and show you how they hang together, how treaties and science around sustainability are entering into a conversation that would have been unimaginable 30 years ago. So what I want to do is discuss two interconnected practices or processes of reconciliation. The first is the reconciliation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, natives and newcomers, with each other. And the second is the reconciliation of both Indigenous people and settlers, human beings in general, reconciliation with the living earth. That's to say, the reconciliation with all living beings. I will not speak of formal reconciliation procedures carried on by governments and courts. Rather, I'll focus on what I call informal kinds of reconciliation and shared responsibilities we all have to engage in these two kinds of reconciliation. This poster that you saw a moment ago speaks of reconciliation and responsibility for our shared future. And I take this to refer to these two types of reconciliation together. That's to say, natives and newcomer on the one hand, and with the living earth on the other, and the shared responsibilities that we need to pick up as students, as professors, as citizens, in order to try to bring into being a sustained future for our descendants. So my key suggestion of the lecture is that these two practices of reconciliation have to be brought into being and carried on together if they're going to be successful. Our relationships with each other and our relationships with the living earth are far too interdependent and entangled to treat reconciliation separately as if they were independent. They've been woven together since first contact in countless ways, sometimes in good ways, but also multiple forms of intergenerational social and ecological suffering. Just think for a moment of trying to separate these two types of reconciliation. If we try to reconcile Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples with each other without reconciling our way of relating to the living earth, we'll fail because the unsustainable and crisis-ridden relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the present that we're trying to reconciliate in various ways has its deepest roots, I think, in the unsustainable and crisis-ridden relationship between human beings and the living earth. I want to just lift this up a little bit with something, maybe a book or something I can give it a bit more height. Oh, that's probably perfect. Thank you. Yeah. That's what I need. Okay. So I want to speak about these two types of reconciliation together, and the first thing I'm doing here is saying, imagine trying to do them separately, trying to separate them off as two different types of reconciliation. And I don't think we can do it because the roots of the problems we're having between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and those modes of reconciliation, the reason they're not working is because the deepest roots of that division between us are in or rooted in this unsustainable relationship we have to the living earth. If we don't challenge that at the same time, it constantly undermines or subverts even the most well-meaning and freestanding efforts to reconcile this unsustainable relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples through modern treaties and consultations, as Sherry was mentioning a moment ago, and as we've seen really since the Royal Commission in 1995. On the other hand, if we try to reconcile the unsustainable relationship with the living earth without addressing the unsustainable relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, I think we'll fail to discern and realize a good, sustainable relationship, because such a relationship is actually discovered and learned through practice. We come to see the contours of a sustainable way of life only through enacting it. Indigenous people have been living in sustainable ways with the living earth for at least 10,000 years. Indigenous peoples still have these living, traditional, ecological knowledges of sustainable practices in the ecoregions in which this know-how has been generated and learned and passed on for generations. These are the embedded practical knowledges needed to see how to make the tradition to a sustainable relationship with the living earth. Of course, we need to draw on Western sciences as well. However, many of these sciences developed along with what I'm calling this underlying and unsustainable relationship with the living earth during the Anthropocene age, from the early 1700s on. As a result, they tend to presuppose and overlook the unsustainable relationship to the living earth. Fortunately, I think, for life on Earth, a different way of thinking about the living earth and our interdependent relationships within it has begun to be developed in the life sciences and the earth sciences over the last 50 years, and I'll talk about that in the second part of the lecture. So hence, the point here is a point made by the Indigenous Peoples Working Group on Climate Change. It's a global network. They recommend that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people join hands, work together, share and test traditional and Western knowledges on equal footing if we're going to get at the roots of both the ecological crisis and the social crisis and work out conciliatory and sustainable alternatives. Okay, so once we begin to see that these two relationships, native and newcomer, and our relationship to the living earth, are connected systemically, I also want to say there's an educational relationship between these two types of reconciliation. First, we learn how to reconcile differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and live together, not only by learning arts of conciliation or peacemaking, but also the arts and sciences of learning to live sustainably with the living earth. For there are important lessons from a sustainable human with nature relationship for a sustainable human with human relationship. And there are even more fundamental lessons to learn from the ways that non-human living systems have sustained themselves and co-evolved over 3.5 billion years. Use that knowledge for working up human with nature relationships and human-human or Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships. So the very way that life itself sustains life in the webs of life that comprise the ecosphere is really our primary teacher in both senses of reconciliation. Indeed, this interdisciplinary education that you're being inducted into in the College of Sustainability, of the ecological sciences and the life sciences on one hand, and the social sciences and the humanities on the other, is the most important pedagogical task of the 21st century. If we're to have a sustainable future, it's really our task as educators and as students to work together across these disciplines. This is how Fritz Capra famously puts the educational challenge in front of us, and here's the quote. The key to an operational definition of ecological sustainability is the realization that we don't need to invent sustainable human communities from scratch, but can model them after nature's ecosystems, which are sustainable communities of plants, animals, and microorganisms. Since the outstanding characteristic of the Earth household is the inherent ability to sustain life, a sustainable human community is one designed in such a manner that its way of life, its business, its economies, its federations, its physical structures and technologies do not interfere with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. Sustainable communities and networks evolve their patterns of living over time in continual interaction with other living systems, both human and non-human. So this is a really nice compressed view of the view I'm going to put before you in the lecture. So this interactive and dynamic view of education isn't something new. And let me now turn to the Indigenous side of this story a little bit. First, ever since settlers arrived on Great Turtle Island, Indigenous people have said that the proper way to reconcile our differences and live sustainably is just to enter into conciliatory treaty negotiations, and these will bring into being peaceful and friendly relationships among us. These conciliatory negotiations are never perfect, they tell us. They're activities in which participants learn by trial and error how to conciliate each other and our differences. Future generations always have to return to treaty talks and renew them as new circumstances arise, as you will have to do in your lifetime. But secondly, the second point Indigenous people are making, they've also insisted that sustainable coexistence by means of treaty negotiations and peaceful and friendly relationships that treaties create isn't a social system that they invented from scratch. Rather, they say that they learn these lessons on how to conciliate and live with the settlers from their interactions and negotiation with other living relatives and kins. That is, sustainable relationships with plants and animals, streams and rivers, mountains and seasons, ecosystems, and Mother Earth as a whole. They often speak of these relationships with their more than human relatives as treaty relationships. And maybe Nancy Turner talked a bit about this last Thursday night when she was here. And the third point they're trying to make in the treaty negotiations, that even these pedagogical relationships are not the primary ground of their knowledge of how to live in conciliatory and sustainable ways. They say they've learned how to live sustainably with the living earth by learning how the webs of non-human forms of life live together symbiotically. That is, how life sustains life. This is the basic life world in which the other two sustainable ways of life emerge and in which they have their interdependent being. For example, you'll probably remember from Professor John Burrell's talk that this educational view is succinctly expressed in the Anishinaabe word for education, where this word for education points you towards learning from the earth. The word gives this whole direction to our way of thinking about sustainability. Learn something from Mother Earth. But this isn't all, these three lessons we get, if we listen hard to what these peace and friendship treaties are trying to tell us. Indigenous people have an exceptionally important way of trying to bring settlers around to see that the conciliatory and sustainability skills one is supposed to learn in treaty negotiations are actually derived from these two broader types of living relationship in which treaty negotiations take place. They do this by exchanging gifts before and after the treaty negotiations. The reason for this is that the cyclical exchange of gifts is the exemplar and the reminder of the way life sustains life symbiotically. Every second of the day, the living earth gives countless gifts of goods and services needed to sustain all interdependent forms of life, beginning with the air you're breathing right now in this room. Each interdependent form of life not only sustains itself, but also in so doing produces goods and services that help to sustain others. Accordingly, the way life sustains life by reproducing conditions of life is portrayed by Indigenous people as the mutual exchange of gifts among interdependent partners. The gift exchange at Treaty Talks then reminds the partners that they too should see themselves as both embedded in these cyclical gift relationships and bringing into being new ones in the negotiations. Just as the living earth consists of gift reciprocity relationships that sustain the living members, so humans should relate to the living earth and each other in their social relationships in the same general way. That is, here's the gift relationship, right? You give a gift, the recipient expresses through their emotions the emotion of gratitude in return, and this emotion of gratitude for the gift moves the recipient to give a gift in turn, either to the person who gave it to them, or they pay it forward. They give it to another living being. Okay. In so doing, participants in the gift exchange bring into being and continue gift, gratitude, reciprocity, networks, and cycles that co-sustain all participants. Treaty and social networks, therefore, mimic self-sustaining ecological networks. It's the point of the gift exchange. If conversely they fail to reciprocate with the living earths or with their treaty partners, appropriate and use gifts with ingratitude, then they break the cycles that sustain life in both cases, destroy the cyclical networks that are the conditions of life for their neighbors and themselves, and eventually destroy themselves. So accordingly, the exchange of gifts before and after treaty talks reminds the participants that they have shared responsibilities to connect or to reconnect with the gift, gratitude, reciprocity circle that sustains all forms of life. As Taiage Alfred has taught me, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, for example, explain their call to consciousness before treaty talks in the following way. You can read this in his book, Wasaze. Here's the quote. The original instructions direct that we who walk about on the earth are to express a great respect and affection and gratitude towards all the spirits which create and support life. We give a greeting and a thanksgiving to the many supporters of our life, the corn, the beans, the squash, the wind, the sun. When people cease to respect and express gratitude for those many things, then all life will be destroyed. End of quote. The living networks and cycles then of gift, gratitude, reciprocity are the model not only for treaty relationships, but for social and economic relationships more generally. On the northwest coast where I'm from, the central term for systems of law and government is just potlatch, patch itla, which just means to give and to give in return. You explain all your government, your law, your politics, your economic exchanges through this gift, gratitude, reciprocity cycle. Okay, so the point here is that these views of interdependency and shared responsibilities that we're talking about and you talk about in your college aren't new or unusual. They go back thousands of years. Quite the contrary. What the new and unusual view is the one that's become predominant in the Anthropocene age, of independence of human relationships from ecological relationships and from each other. And so the separation of these two types of reconciliation processes in Canada. It's astonishing, actually, that anyone ever thought that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people could reconcile themselves without simultaneously reconciling our relationship with the living earth. It shows how deeply we've been influenced by an alienated relationship to the living earth in the modern period. It's as if we're negotiating treaty relationships with one another and not realizing that we're also walking and standing and sitting on this living earth, breathing its clean air, and receiving all the gifts it provides to keep us alive. That is, we overlook our ecological footprint and our ecological self. So I'm not referring here in my talk on reconciliation to relationships that are standardly negotiated in formal reconciliation processes, things like sovereignty, jurisdiction, land claims, and so on. I'm referring to this primary underlying relationship of Homo sapiens with the living earth that's articulated in terms of the gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationship by Indigenous people. This is our basic mode of being in the life world with other living beings, a reciprocal and interactive relationship of ongoing attunement, disturbance, and reattunement by means of our plurireflexive senses and perceptions. Following Aldo Leopold in the land ethic, I call this primary relationship an ethical relationship. Our shared responsibilities to reconcile unsustainable relationships derive from and are the expression of, I believe, this basic ethical relationship. These are shared responsibilities we have as, we might say, plain members and citizens of the commonwealth of all forms of life. So if the two projects of reconciliation are as interdependent systemically and educationally, then what's the appropriate form of reconciliation to carry them out successfully? This is the question I want to explore in the lecture, if I have enough time, which I hope I do. I want to mention a few criteria of the concept, or very robust concept, or very traditional concept of reconciliation that I'm going to use, so it's not confused with, I think, a weaker and less demanding concept of reconciliation that's in wide use today. The Nuu-chah-nulth and the Haida have an expression for the dense interdependency that I've just mentioned, and you can see up there. When they have a situation that requires reconciliation, they standardly begin by reminding themselves that everything depends on everything else, a very famous Haida expression. Once we see ourselves as always already in relationships of mutual support, the appropriate concept of reconciliation appears to be, first, reconciliation with all living beings, then rather than reconciliation to some independent state of affairs, and secondly, reconciliation as ongoing shared practices with all our relatives at once, rather than reconciliation as segmented processes oriented to a definitive end state. That is, in my view, reconciliation is the continuation of this primary ethical relationship that I've just tried to articulate through the gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationship. So let me talk a little bit about some features of this way of thinking about reconciliation that partly derives in the Western tradition, down through Hegel and so on, but has very powerful resonances in Indigenous ways of talking about reconciliation. So first, it's a form of reconciliation that I'm talking about here. It's a form of activity that comes on the scene in response to a crisis in the way of life of the people involved. The relationship among them has become crisis-ridden, unsustainable. The people involved become distrustful, conflictual, aggressive rather than peaceful, alienated from each other, estranged from the living earth. If they continue to reproduce their relationships, they'll destroy themselves and the interrelated forms of life of their neighbors. When they try to respond to the crisis, the result is to amplify rather than to attenuate the destructive effects of their unsustainable way of life. Their unsustainable way of life is a vicious cycle rather than a virtuous cycle. From within this crisis, their relationships appear irreconcilable. I believe that's actually the unsustainable situation we're in today in Canada with respect to relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on the one hand and the living earth on the other. The crisis of Indigenous people is beyond reasonable doubt. It's been exhaustively reported and studied and documented from the 1960s through the Royal Commission to the various attempts to address it in the 2000s and to its persistence today. As John Burroughs said quite recently, Aboriginal people's lives are drastically shorter than other Canadians and marked by more suffering as measured by considerably higher rates of poverty, injury, and incarceration, significantly lower levels of education, income, and health. This did not occur in an instant. We have long passed the tipping point in the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and others. We are in a crisis mode, and there is no politically driven prospect of salvaging the relationship. It's already broken and lies in ruin all around us, end of quote. And this is a very temperate man, John Burroughs. He doesn't speak like this unless he's really reflected on it. The ecological crisis of the very conditions of life on Earth is also beyond reasonable doubt, since the early reports on climate change, global warming, pollution, limits to growth, as early as the 60s, to endless studies and reports, the leading Earth scientists in the world and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we know that our dominant way of life is overshooting the carrying capacity of Earth and destroying the conditions that sustain life. So we're facing a crisis, and we would require a particular type of reconciliation response. The second feature of this way of thinking about reconciliation is that it's a mode of ethical practice with others here and now. That's to say, we're in these unsustainable relationships. There isn't an outside that we can stand apart from them. We have to somehow learn to exercise our responsibilities within these crisis-ridden relationships to the environment and to our neighbors, somehow within the very relations we bear as consumers and producers. Okay. The third feature of reconciliation, as I'm using it, is that the role of practices of reconciliation, I guess it's the key feature, is to actually transform the crisis-ridden relationships in which we're entangled and the social and ecological suffering they cause. The aim is to work together to transform unsustainable relationships into conciliatory and sustainable ones. That's to say, to transform vicious social systems into virtuous social systems that sustain the ways of life of all affected. The cooperative work of transformation is carried out by exercising our shared responsibilities. So in this view, our shared responsibilities turn out to be shared sustainabilities, our abilities not only to act responsibly, but in so doing, to act sustainably, to bring about sustainable social relations. These responsibilities are shared, I think, in a very interesting and special sense. We can't see that we have these shared responsibilities from within the practices and worldview of the unsustainable relationship to the earth that we inhabit. They're overlooked. From this dominant perspective, we see ourselves as independent of the living earth and our neighbors, with individual responsibilities to look after ourselves and those who we choose to contract with. We have to free ourselves from these everyday practices and begin to interact with others as our interdependent kin for these more basic shared responsibilities of interdependent partnerships to come into view. When we do this, we bring to self-consciousness or self-awareness the common good of interdependent conciliation and sustainability and our corresponding responsibilities. That's to say, we become aware of our larger ecological self and our ecological footprint through engaging in practices of this kind. The fourth feature of reconciliation, the so-called Gandhian feature of it, is that the means and the ends have to be the same, like an acorn to the fully grown oak tree. The only way to bring about reconciliation is by conciliatory means, because means are constitutive of ends. So reconciliation is really a reconciliation of the partners by acting and interacting in conciliatory and sustainable ways in our everyday relations with each other and the living earth. We have to be the change we wish to bring about here and now. This constitutive view of means and ends, or prefigurative, as Glenn Coulthard, the Dene scholar, calls it, is at the heart of the alternative dispute resolution tradition in the West that I partly derived from, made famous by Gandhi and his followers. Peace by peaceful means, right? Peace and reconciliation by peaceful nonviolent means. However, it has a complementary peacemaking tradition in Indian country. Here, people in a crisis situation exercise their shared responsibilities by saying we bury the hatchet. That is, we're going to forego violence and turn to the path of peacemaking by peaceful negotiation. They begin to enter into practice of reconciliation by becoming of one mind. Here I'm talking about the way the Gaza Mohawks talk about it. That is, of beginning to become conciliatory in their own interactions. They enter into tough treaty negotiations in conciliatory and friendly ways, orienting to transforming the crisis-ridden relationship between them. By negotiating in this contentious yet conciliatory and friendly way, they bring into being peaceful and friendly relationships that sustain them until another crisis erupts and they return to treaty negotiations and reconciliate once again. Hence the term peace and friendship treaties for the early modern treaties, including those here. The way of conciliation, of peaceful and friendly negotiation, is thus contentious but non-violent. It's embodiment of the change you're trying to bring about in the larger society. So reconciliation, in this more traditional sense, literally means to conciliate again. I mean, in Latin, that's what it means, to conciliate again. Practices of reconciliation transform the conduct of the partners from the conflict-ridden and unsustainable relationships into a kind of conciliatory, sustainable way of life out of which the crisis emerged in the first place. So there's a kind of meta circle here of three life cycles. The first is a basic conciliatory way of life that sustains all life on Earth, and in which disturbances and disputes are resolved by normal practices of conciliation. Then secondly, unpredictable transformation of such a system into a vicious and unsustainable cycle that tends towards the destruction of the contending parties. The situation we're in today, ecologically, and in our relations with natives and newcomers. And then thirdly, the response of extraordinary practices of reconciliation that, if successful, reconnect the partners to conciliatory and sustainable relationships with each other in the living earth once again. If the reconciliation fails, the crisis-ridden system crosses a tipping point and collapses either in whole or in part. The co-evolution of life on Earth has experienced many examples of successful and unsuccessful cycles of reconciliation. And the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples suggested in Volume 1 of its reports that the history of relationships between Indigenous people and settlers also can be seen in terms of these cycles of conciliation in the early modern period, through conflict and vicious cycles developing, and then attempts at reconciliation. However, my point is, in 2014, attempts at reconciliation through treaty-like negotiations, modern treaties, as Sherry mentioned, co-management agreements and so on, have not been transformative. They've been, let's say, incremental. And the reason they haven't been transformative is that they've not been dealt with together. The two crises haven't been faced at the same time by the kind of deep reconciliation practices that I think all citizens have to bear responsibility for. So I want to now turn and look at how these practices work by looking at what the ecological sciences and Earth systems theory can tell us about sustainable practices and sustainable social systems. And then I want to quickly look at this unsustainable way of life that we've adopted under modern conditions the last 400 years. And then very quickly look at some practices of reconciliation, many of which are going on in the College of Sustainability here, and also parallel practices going on the West Coast at my university. So let's turn now to the modern earth sciences and see what they can tell us. Remember, Fritz Capra tells us this is where we can learn from. How can we learn from life systems, how to organize our human systems so they don't damage the living earth and also create sustainable relations between humans with deep differences. Okay, so the life sciences give us 4 hypotheses over the last 40 years that I think can really help us in this project. So the first hypothesis is simply this, that sustained life is a property of of ecological systems rather than of single organisms or species. Animals depend on the photosynthesis of plants for their energy needs. Plants depend upon carbon dioxide produced by the animals, as well as on the nitrogen fixed by bacteria at their roots. And these living entities interdependently coupled with abiotic rocks, atmosphere, and water. The major factor in coevolution of forms of life, thus, is symbiosis, the ways that organisms and ecosystems live together. This refers to the way that relations of interdependence within and among organisms and ecosystems are mutually supportive of their members. For example, the way that animals depend on photosynthesis of plants, plants depend on carbon dioxide produced by animals, and so on in a circular manner. In the activities of sustaining themselves, living systems help to sustain living systems around them. This symbiotic relationship of reciprocal sustainability amongst interdependent living systems is how life sustains life. It's called a virtuous cycle because it reproduces itself, becoming more complex. Moreover, it gives rise to symbiogenesis, that's to say the emergence of new systems of life out of the background symbiotic relationships, creating the immense biodiversity of forms of life over billions of years. And here I'm thinking of Lynn Margulis's work. So it's easy to see, as ethnobotanist Nancy Turner probably told you last Thursday night, that this feature of life is what Indigenous people refer to when they speak of this virtuous relationship of gift, gratitude, reciprocity in nature and in human relationships. What they've been trying to tell us settlers at Treaty Talks since the first encounter. Similarly, it's easy to see that symbiotic relationships can be described as peace and friendship relations. That is, relationships in which different ways of life support the neighbor's way of life around them. It's also easy to see that the mutually supportive middle ground between Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of life that was created in the early modern period during treaty negotiations is an example of learning from symbiogenesis. And we can also describe these symbiotic relationships as the mutual exercise of shared responsibilities to sustain life. So a very interesting conversion of the most advanced life science and traditional ecological knowledge. Thinking about living systems in this symbiotic way brings to awareness the ecological self in contrast to the independent or ego self of our dominant way of life. We realize that if we wish to live well, we should live in such a way that our way of life supports the way of life of those with whom we are related, and they should do the same in reciprocity. Despite this individualistic and competitive relationship of the dominant economy, we are still participants in multiple social systems of this symbiotic kind. Relationships within families, with neighborhoods, communities of practice, with fellow workers and fellow students, sharing knowledge and so on, collective work in the classroom. These are an array of social networks that are of this symbiotic form. Many psychologists now talk about these symbiotic relationships as the bedrock of communities and of human well-being. They even describe, these are psychologists in 2014, describe these relationships in terms of gift, gratitude, reciprocity networks. Okay, so that's one big convergence between modern science and traditional Indigenous science. The second one is this. The evolution of all complex symbiotic feedback loops among life systems, atmosphere, rocks, and water has symbiogenetically given rise to the biosphere, the ecosphere, as a whole. That is, as an evolving, self-regulating ensemble that has maintained habitable conditions on the surface of the planet over vast stretches of geological time. Earth systems scientist Sir James Lovelock named this the Gaia Hypothesis in the late 60s. As Lynn Margulis commented, it's symbiosis and symbiogenesis from a planetary perspective. The Gaia Hypothesis has since sustained several tests, now accepted, in one form or another by a wide range of scientists and majority of the members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So Gaia, the Gaia hypothesis here, is just the Greek term for the earth as the living earth, as the animate earth, as animated. The idea that the earth is alive, is anima, is a view shared by indigenous cultures, many religious traditions, as well as by the ancient Greeks and early modern Europeans. For the last 400 years, we've been taught this dominant Western view that the earth is in fact inanimate, a mechanism of some kind or another, and that the animate view was nothing but a pre-modern primitive superstition. But with this Gaia hypothesis, there's now a growing convergence in conversation, in theory and practice, between leading trends in Western science and complementary fields of indigenous sciences. Third feature. Complex, overlapping, nonlinear systems of symbiotic and symbiogenetic relationships aren't stable or harmonious. Their interactions are cooperative, but also competitive, and often far from equilibrium. They change and transform continuously as they interact and readjust to the interactions of their neighbors. That is, living systems are dynamic systems that correspond to disturbances in complex ways that systems theorists call positive and negative feedback loops. Negative feedback, the initial change is counteracted. In positive feedback, the initial change is amplified. Feedback loops are the circles of participation by which living systems bring about either constancy or change. These circles of participation are called dynamic conciliation. And then I'm playing on the use of that, borrowing that term of conciliation from the life sciences. Now, it's always possible that a positive feedback loop that causes a system to move away from dynamic equilibrium may bring a series of loops that move the system further away until it reaches a tipping point and transforms into an unsustainable and crisis-ridden system. That is, systems transform themselves from conciliatory feedback loops of sustainable interaction, virtuous cycles, into unsustainable relationships by a series of feedback loops, into a vicious cycle, and eventually systemic collapse in many cases. So systems theories explain the ecological crisis and the indigenous settler crisis in exactly these terms. Okay. Fourth feature is the feature about these tipping points. A familiar example of the cascading positive feedback loop is when a canoe begins to tip. We're all Canadians, we should know this. Begins to tip in response to a disturbance, and further responses, crew runs the wrong way, amplify the tipping until the canoe overturns. New Chalmouth legal scholar Johnny Mack uses the example of the tipping canoe to characterize how colonization, assimilation, modern treaty negotiations have estranged the New Chalmouth from their traditional territories, knowledges, and practices, and assimilated them to an alien and unsustainable way of life. Their once sustainable way of life on the west coast of Vancouver Island, as Johnny puts it, has been overturned like a canoe. It's had this ripple effect of tipping their whole way of life over. The Haida, a little further north from the New Chalmouth, have this expression for this tipping point, really very famous on the west coast, that's inherent in all living systems. They have this saying, the world is as sharp as a knife. Okay? And this is how the great Haida artist who studied with Bill Reed, Robert Davidson, describes it. Nanny told me, grandmother told me, that wherever we walk, we're walking on a knife's edge. The world is as sharp as the edge of a knife is a Haida expression. The knife's edge is just on the ground, and if we're not careful, we'll fall off. That's how Nanny said it. And it guides you on how to live your life. I see the knife's edge as the present moment. Okay? So Davidson's point is that in any living system, it's always possible that the seemingly conciliatory and sustainable relationship in which we live may tip over into an unsustainable relationship. Moreover, Davidson stresses that we have to take this radical feature of conciliatory and sustainable systems of living together into account and let it guide us how to live our lives. We have to be careful or we'll fall off, right? In the Indigenous sense, that we have to exercise our shared responsibilities to care for the symbiotic relationships that care for us, or else we'll upset them. Well, we haven't been caretakers in the Anthropocene in this reciprocal way. Rather, we've become planetary destroyers. And these are the words of E.O. Wilson, perhaps the most famous scientist in the States. So now I want to turn and examine this underlying cause, the unsustainable relationship to the living earth that I'm saying is at the base of the ecological crisis and climate change, but also at the base of our inability to solve the crisis through these modern treaty processes. And then we'll be in a better position to see what counts as a good response to it. Yeah, okay, well, I will at least give you what I see now as the root of these two crises in this here, okay. So this unsustainable relationship, which is actually coterminous in time with the rise of the Anthropocene. We usually say the Anthropocene began in 1784, I think, with James Watt and the steam engine. But I roll it back a little late 16th century. But anyhow, for the last 400 years, an unsustainable relationship to the earth developed first in Europe and then was spread by European imperial expansion around the world, and it's now called modernization. And this is the driving force of the Anthropocene age. The key to seeing this unsustainable relationship, to get out of it and see its roots, I think, is to reflect on a saying Indigenous people across Canada use themselves to distance themselves from this relationship. Since the 1960s, Indigenous people have been saying the following: the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land. How many times have we heard that? If our mode of being in the world is one of being engaged participants in living, interdependent, and symbiotic ecological and social relationships and cycles of gift, gratitude, reciprocity that sustain all forms of life, then the true expression of this way of life, this mode of being in the world, is belonging to the land, to the living earth. That is, we belong in the first instance to this great commonwealth of earthlings and have shared responsibilities to sustain it and our fellow members, as we've already seen. From this orientation, it would be absurd to say that we stand in a relation of ownership or property to the living earth. Ojibwe elder Basil Johnston says, this is like saying you have private property in your mother. Who would say that, right? Yet this relationship of land belonging to humans has displaced the earlier relationship of belonging to the land, has become the basis of our modern way of life and the cause of the crisis. Although things, I think, began to change in the sedentary agricultural revolution 11,000 years ago, the really great transformation to this view that we own the land belongs to us, the real transformation takes place over the last 400 years and really taken off all the graphs. If you read Stephen Emmett's book, 12 Billion, all the graphs take off in the 20th century, right? And there are many accounts of this great transformation. In fact, every major social theory over the last 200 years tried to make sense of it. But anyhow, I'm really keen on Carl Polanyi's explanation of this, and I want to just walk you through it to remind you how deep this man saw the basis of our current crisis. In 1944, he was sitting in upstate Vermont, writing a book called The Great Transformation. So Polanyi argued, Q&A, we can talk about Polanyi. I promise I'll stop in time for a Q&A. So Polanyi argued that during this great transformations, humans have become disembedded beings from participation in the interdependent ecological and social relationships that sustain life, and then we've been re-embedded in abstract and competitive economic, political, and legal relations that are dependent on, yet destructive of, the underlying interdependent ecological and social relationships we've been talking about. This great disembedding, he says, has taken place in 3 steps. First, the peoples who are embedded in symbiotic ecological and social relationships are dispossessed of their way of life and their territories in which it's carried on. This happened first in Europe in the Enclosure of the Commons, and then by the dispossession of indigenous people throughout the non-European world by what's called the Second Great Enclosure. That's to say, colonization of the non-West by the West. The second step, Polanyi argues, is what happened is the imposition of an ownership relation to the land by the spread of Western legal systems of private property, and so to transform the earth into property, as Anthony Hall puts it, probably in his famous book that some of you will have read. Polanyi describes the privatization of land as a fictitious commodity, because land is not a commodity produced for sale on the market. What we now call commodifiable and exchangeable natural resources are, as we have seen, interdependent co-participants in the symbiotic webs and cycles of life that sustain life on Earth. Relating to the living Earth as a kind of storehouse of commodifiable resources disembeds them from this interdependent ecological relationship and then re-embeds them in the abstract and competitive relations of the global market system. The ecosystems in which the resources are embedded are then treated as externals, externalities, to the global system of commodification, and they're radically changed. The result of development under this system is the destruction of the webs of interdependent ecological relationships that sustain the natural and the human world, giving rise to the environmental crisis and climate change. Next step. Once the means of reproduction of life are placed under the ownership of corporations, the final step, Polanyi says, is to treat our own capabilities, our own abilities to produce things and consume things as human beings as commodities for sale on the labor market by the spread of Western contract law, labor law, and corporate law. This kind of commodification disembeds human and producing and consuming capabilities and activities from their surrounding social and ecological relationships in which they take place, the communities in which we live, and re-embeds them in abstract, competitive, and non-democratic global market relations. Polanyi describes the commodification of human capabilities of individuals, as the second fictitious commodity of modernization. It is fictitious because, of course, our individual capabilities to work together and sustain ourselves aren't commodities made for the market. These capabilities are, as we've seen in the previous section, the cooperative responsibilities and sustainabilities through which humans participate in the social and ecological systems that conciliate and sustain life on Earth. They are the capabilities through which we belong to the land and are grounded in it. Yet they're now, in the Anthropocene, treated as abstract capabilities that we as separate individuals own under this self-ownership model, and by selling the use of these abilities to a corporation, they become the means by which we insert ourselves into this global market system. The underlying social systems that producers and consumers live in and which sustain them, their families, their communities, their First Nations, their networks, and so on, are treated as externalities to the market system. The result of development under this system is the destruction of the webs of interdependent social relations of mutual aid that sustain human communities, giving rise to the well-known forms of social suffering of modern life. So at the end of the book, Polanyi, here's 1944, just almost the end of World War II, he says, this is what is going to happen if this continues. He says, to allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment would result in the demolition of society. Robbed of the protective covering of cultural institutions, human beings would perish from the effects of social exposure. They would die as the victims of acute social dislocation through vice, perversion, crime, and starvation. Nature would be reduced to its elements, neighborhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, the power to produce food and raw materials destroyed. End of quote. Despite Polanyi's warning and hundreds of others since 1944, this global system of double commodification in which the human species is re-embedded into the system continues to unfold as he predicted. It's now a deeply entrenched, vicious cycle, which global systems theorists in my department and probably your department speak of now as an automaton, as a system that's on automatic pilot. So given that if that's true, that's the underlying cause of the ecological crisis, I want to show now why it's the cause of the crisis around treaty talks and so on, and this thin version of reconciliation that we're getting and isn't really helping that much. So let's look at this. When we try to, under this system, reconcile the crisis between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people through modern treaties, consultations, co-management, and so on. In this situation, Indigenous people, I think, have two choices. They can accept the treaty or co-management agreement, enter into the dominant economy, receive jobs, or they can refuse and remain poor and marginalized. If they accept, they are assimilated into the global market system, disembedded from their Indigenous ways of life, of belonging to the land. They have to abandon the conciliatory and sustainable life they have been trying to uphold and to share with settlers since first contact. Their canoe gets overturned, in Johnny Mac's phrase. If they refuse, they're marginalized and impoverished and unable to sustain their traditional way of life. That's what this modern crisis, I think, is all about. This is a deep economic crisis, social crisis, ecological crisis, also a deep spiritual crisis if you have this relationship to the land as your living mother, as this ground of your being. As John Burroughs and Taiage Alfred, my colleague in UVic, bring to our attention for Taiage, it's a spiritual crisis at its heart. Yet this deep crisis and its basis in unsustainable relationships to the living earth isn't raised and confronted in the dominant reconciliation processes. Rather, these processes overlook the symbiotic social and ecological systems of gift, gratitude, reciprocity economies on which all life depends, but which they keep destroying. Yet it's precisely these social and ecological gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationships that provide the solution to these crises. So I have another section here on just talking about practices of reconciliation once we see our crisis that way. But I see I'm running pretty late here in the program, so I could. What do you think? A couple of minutes, or just I'm happy to stop here? No. Okay. Okay, let me just quickly, I was going to talk about how you move around from being in this. There's a wonderful Raven story that the Haida have. For the problem, we're in this system and we live in it and consume it and produce in it, have our jobs in it and so on. And we can't really see this alternative very clearly until we step out of it. So the Haida have these very interesting stories for how we step out of this vicious cycle that we've caught ourselves up in the last 300 or 400 years and move around. But let's just move around and look at a couple of practices of reconciliation that I think are really confronting this problem at this very deep level. So here's a quote from Robert Davison, which I want to use as just an entree into practices of reconciliation that I think can be effective. Robert Davison says, so this Haida artist lives on Haida Gwaii, right? So we're now coming full circle, he says. We are the fourth generation, Haida, in which the white people have instilled their ideas and values, this vicious cycle, their ideas and values, and denied our way of life without any knowledge or concern for who we were and where we were coming from. It's our generation now that's making the attempt to bridge the gap, to reclaim our identity, our cultural values, the philosophies developed by our ancestors for generations and generations. But we're also the generation making a great effort to reconnect with the land. The land is the very foundation of our culture. It's our homeland. We're born into it. We are the stewards. It's our right and our responsibility to maintain nature and preserve it for the future. So let me mention just a couple of examples that derive from that Davidsonian way of working on this great dual project in front of us. The exercise of shared responsibilities and practice of reconciliation can take place almost anywhere. They can begin by just joining together, acting together, learning together in conciliatory and sustainable ways with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, with the living earth, where we begin to reconnect. In so doing, we sow these seeds of conciliatory and sustainable ways of life in the interstices of this unsustainable hegemonic way of life that we all inhabit. As these seeds grow and spread their virtuous relationships of symbiosis, they begin counteracting the vicious relationships. They grow, they offer an alternative, others join in, momentum builds towards reconciliation and transformation on a larger scale. On the West Coast, Indigenous people are engaging in this, or they're engaging in it in the way Davidson talks about. Speak of thickening their traditional practices of reconnecting, relearning, revitalizing, reimagining, and so on. At the University of Victoria, we have a whole bunch of programs where Indigenous and non-Indigenous students study in the Indigenous governance program or the Indigenous law program in the law school, and then they go out into a community and begin to work together on these social forms of social suffering, but also forms of ecological injustice, right here and now in our very communities. These are often called treaty partnerships, because you're working together in peaceful and friendly ways to work through these crisis-ridden relationships that we have. We have a program in the poli-sci department at UVic where you can study the treaty community that you come from, whether you're Indigenous or a settler, and find out what your responsibilities are. And then you go out to that community, you write your essay on what you learned about your shared responsibilities that Sherry was talking about, that come from the peace and friendship treaty way of thinking, and then engage in community-based practices of various kinds. And these kinds of reconnections and partnerships are going on around the world. And it began during the period of decolonization when Schumacher, in his book Small is Beautiful, said, look, we have to go back to economics as if humans mattered in small communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous working together, and with appropriate forms of technology. Vandana Shiva picked it up in the Earth Democracy movement in India, that in turn inspired the food sovereignty movement in Brazil, now has over 200 members in the network. A bunch of farmers in Canada, Indigenous people have joined the food sovereignty network, and so on. So in the book by Paul Hawken called Blessed Unrest, he says this is the biggest movement of movements on the world. If we put together all these community-based movements of various kinds, and he says at its heart and soul, this global movement, at the heart and soul of it is Indigenous culture. In most Indigenous culture, there just is no separate social and environmental movements because the two were never disaggregated. And if I can have one more minute, since I'm just a plain educator, I want to talk about education, but I must tell you, I had dinner with your director of the College of Sustainability, and I think you're years ahead of what's going on at UVic here in trying to build up a kind of education that moves us into this way of thinking about our relationship to the living earth and to our Indigenous partners, and exercising our shared responsibilities. So I think this is what's going on here is going on in other places as well. In thousands of junior high schools, of universities, of kindergarten and day schools, where we're becoming kind of partners in learning. That is, the schools and universities reach out to the communities in which they're located, and they see these communities as epistemic communities of knowledge from which the school and university can learn. So it undermines the old argument that the university is a monopoly of knowledge, right? We go out and tell the world how to organize itself. We know how disastrous that model has been But academics and students now can go out and spend part of their time in a community learning practical know-how around sustainability, both ecologically and socially. And the academic can come and learn as well. But in turn, this academic, she can say, well, I can help you. There's a set of academic research going on here that can help this community. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here because we have all this academic research of what's going on in other places. And this is how these networks are springing up, like little seeds of really deep and fundamental forms of reconciliation of both these deeply damaging relationships that I'm trying to get at the roots of in this talk. And thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you, Jim, for a very wide-ranging and powerful talk. We have some time for questions, and our tradition here is to start with questions from students. You look like a student. So the questioner, while agreeing with much of your talk, has a concern about the time frames.
Yeah.
Do we have the time to build from small seeds these kinds of reconciliations, both with other communities and with the living earth, if we're facing things like the end of all life in oceans by 2048?
Yes. Yeah, great questions. And my father was an ocean scientist, so I grew up with this problem. He was worried about it way back in the 60s out on the West Coast. So I have two answers to it. First is, I think it's the only way that's really going to be a fundamental change. As speaking now as a political theorist, the way you get governments to change is the people change their behavior and they force the government to move in that direction. If we think of how slavery was ended or how women got the vote, it was not by government starting it out, by huge pressure. So I think the only way to bring about this fundamental change is this way. So if it fails, it takes too long, I can't think of another way that could deacidify the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean by 2048 and the death of plankton now. We lost 10 million, the whole scallop fisheries on the West Coast collapsed. We just discovered this 2 weeks ago. But the second, so I hope there's enough time for this because it's the only way it's going to be really effective in the long run. But and part of the reason is that it's just that, well, let's leave it at that. I want to make a second point here. And that's it. I wonder if when we say, oh, it's the tipping point and the sixth mass extinction is going to happen by 2050, we aren't still caught up in a linear temporality of modernization, that everything happens in market time very quickly. And so my thought is maybe when we begin to experience life in this cyclical reciprocity way, our temporality changes. And a lot of the 20th century philosophy that I was trained in was trying to provincialize the modern sense of temporality, that everything happens too quickly and I have to race to keep up. It's this kind of Charlie Chaplin world, right? In modern times, you never can fix things because they're always a little bit ahead of you. But maybe part of, and again I've learned from Indigenous people, when they come and speak, they speak very slowly, they tell you where they're from, they take 20 minutes to do that, and they say, who made the food around here? It's the first thing they ask, thank people for that. And there's a whole nother time sense, and it may be that Gaia is on this other time sense. Because one crucial feature of these cyclical views is if you care for an animal or an ecosystem that you're interdependent on, it reciprocates, it takes care of you. So as these living systems see humans taking this step, beginning to treat them in a sustainable and conciliatory way, they interact. That may sound a bit too way out for you, but in philosophy, there's something called the Santiago theory of cognition, which is precisely making this point philosophically, And it's worth looking into, that the more we act this way, and Paul Hawkins' book, Blessed Unrest, he says we're acting, those of us who are acting like an immune system would act that's being disturbed. It's how your nervous system protects you pre-reflectively from disturbances, changes the temperature, or hears my voice, puts down your hearing a bit so it doesn't sound like a booming and so on. Nature is doing this all the time. So maybe if we begin these thickening our practices, that'll induce a kind of responsiveness in other living beings in response.
Thanks. Other questions? Sure, in the center. So the question is about the disappearance of Bill Reed's sculpture from the $20 bill, and was that, do you think, I mean, I guess your implication is, in the question is, was that a political comment, or was that really just a reference point?
Well, I know nothing about politics, but, and Stephen Harper doesn't tell me why he does things, but there's this book coming out about what's changed in Canada since 2006. And in it is an article by Yasmin Abu-Laban, political science at the University of Alberta, Edmonton. And she points this out, that this was removed from the $20 bill in 2012. And for many people of my generation, this expressed what we were fighting for. Socially and ecologically, Indigenous and non-Indigenous living together in all our crazy interdependency. Everybody's vying for power and recognition and position, but all the paddles are in unison, right? So it's capturing precisely that dynamic equilibrium that we kind of fell in love with in the 2000s. So she points out Harper removed this from the $20 bill, and the new $20 bill, he replaced it with Vimy Ridge, the celebration of our military history. So I think he is. I've only debated him once, and so I don't know him that well, but I think I would say he's taking this view of what we could be as Canadians and replacing it with the view he favors, which emphasizes the War of 1812, Vimy Ridge, our military history, and so on, not our cultural diversity and our embeddedness in this wonderful climate that we live on in this half of North America.
Perhaps a little more in the spirit of Laurier, who said, why did we come and take this land from the Indians if we weren't going to exploit it?
Yes.
At the back.
Yeah.
So the question is about the role of Haida in historic periods in near extinctions of species, in particular sea otter. And so it raises some questions about how that came about. Is that contrary to maybe comments you made about suggesting Indigenous ways are sustainable ways?
Yeah.
Just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think we should read more of Robert Davidson, because he takes out this point, that our ability and knowledge to live sustainably is fallible knowledge. We can go wrong, we can make mistakes, we can cause tipping points without even realizing it. One of his examples is the logging practices on Haida Gwaii and the destructiveness they cause to the marbled murrelets on Haida Gwaii. So he says we Haida become voracious or ravenous ourselves. We've been caught up in this vicious cycle. And that's so this double reconnection is one with the living earth, but also with traditions, with a critical eye to the failures that every culture has made. We Westerners aren't the only ones that have done great damage to the environment. So it's not a wholesale endorsement of one people who have all the answers, but of people who build into their learning processes this reflexivity and trial and error way of thinking about acquiring practical knowledge about our relation to the environment.
Go there next. So the questioner is mentioning a Norwegian philosopher. I didn't catch the name, but and she couldn't really pronounce it. Okay, that's fair. But whose argument was that humans are really members of a kind of biosphere web or a biosphere net, and that this seemed to have analogies to what you were speaking of. Your question seemed to be, like, is that the case, and how do we cope with that, and how do, if we are, how do we use that knowledge?
So we're talking about Arne Naess, Naess, great Norwegian philosopher and ecologist and Gandhian, wrote books on deep ecology and Gandhian nonviolence, and introduced into the Norwegian school system, not the university, but the high school system, and it was adopted throughout Scandinavia, nonviolent forms of human communication, derived partly from Gandhi, but also deeply, his big influence in the Scandinavian countries was on this concept of the ecological self. Once we see ourselves as interdependent, we see ourself as internally related to the living beings that we're interdependent with. So the question is that possible? And for Arne Naess, I only met him once. I met him in Australia at an environmental conference, an amazing guy. But he had his own hut that he would go up to on this mountain and live in for months to get back in touch with the land. And we have to all develop our own practices. Think of, I mean, you're not too far from Vermont. There's an ecologist at the University of Vermont. Her name is Stephanie Kaza. And her book is called Mindfully Green. And she just takes everyday students and fellow colleagues who want to take her courses and say, let's just go out somewhere and find a practice that we're comfortable with, where we kind of get in touch with the earth, or even just our garden, or outside these walls, where we feel those trees breathing for us, we breathing in their air, breathing out carbon dioxide, they take that in. And she gives us all these very practical, everyday practices we can do to overcome what's called in the literature the nature deficit disorder. I don't know if you've run across this, but it's a guy named David Rove in the States. Worth reading, because he says that's the biggest educational challenge here for environmental education, is this nature deficit. We can live our whole lives in Manhattan or Halifax or without even knowing where our food comes from, or how that air we're breathing has 20% oxygen, and because of plankton in the ocean and so on. We don't get that story. So it's our job, you and me as educators, to get this out. And the thing I love about Stephanie Kaza's book, Mindfully Green, is as she goes through the book and explains how she's been doing this for 30 years in Vermont, she gives us little exercises. And in my classes, we do these. We go out and walk around in the trees around the University of Victoria. So yeah, I think it can be done, and I think it is being done.
We could all step out into the rain.
Yeah. Rain in Victoria, too.
First comment and then a question. Current scientific paradigm is thinking that the whole Earth is a lab.
I'm sorry?
Thinking that the whole Earth is like a lab.
Like?
So your common scientific paradigm sees the whole world as a lab,
It's a lab.
a laboratory.
A laboratory. So, how do you see the role of science to be an enabler of this reconciliation process?
So the question is, what's your sense of the role of science as an enabler for the kind of changes towards sustainability and reconciliation? I guess implicit in your first comment is an idea that if science looks at the Earth as inanimate, as a laboratory, or potentially as inanimate, potentially as a laboratory, then how does it draw into a kind of ethical relationship, which may not allow that same freedom of experiment? Is that fair?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So my answer to that is that there are two forms of Western science loose in the world today. One is as you described it. And so getting to know about the natural world is treating it as a laboratory and seeing ourselves as independent of it and being objective and studying its laws of motion. And that has been the dominant one. But there's this other tradition that's coming to us through the life sciences, the ecological sciences, people like Capra, who I mentioned at the beginning, started out in physics. And this tradition goes back, now I could give a very long answer to this, but roughly just to say there is this other way of thinking about science that does try to relate to the earth and understand it as a living being, as a kind of dialogical relation the scientist has to enter into with the living world that they're studying. And this tradition derives in Germany. It's a response to this mechanistic view that they get from the 17th and 18th century. And it comes through people like Herder and Humboldt and down through a counter-tradition where a person observes. Somebody was talking about Stephen Harding, we were talking about him at dinner, has a book called Animate Earth. And so this is the other way of thinking about science. And then it's a scientific method, but it's a participatory scientific method. It's fantastic. And on the West Coast, we had this working for 20 years up around Tofino, where traditional ecological scientists, indigenous New Challenges scientists, were talking to Western scientists about the conditions for the sustainability of the old growth forest there in the protected area. And they were both they were both coming at it from different scientific traditions, but they both had this view that they were participants in a living earth, more complex than they'll ever understand, but trying to get what's called an intuitive understanding of the holism of the living world, which is this other way of Western science. And I guess the greatest philosopher of this, who would we today, I'm thinking now, is probably David Bohm at University of London, BOHM, who just spent the last 30 years of his life re-articulating this originally German tradition in a way that makes sense now of what's going on in our life sciences and our ocean sciences.
Our time is somewhat limited. I think it's actually my pleasure, though, now to call on the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, who's also the presiding Dean of the College of Sustainability, Dr. Robert Somerby Murray, who has a word of thanks. Well.